The mage Drenin was well known even while he was still in the academy of the Kingdom of Mariga. The Kingdom of America was one of the larger dwarven kingdoms on the continent, and it had a well-established magic academy. Large classes, many students, and yet somehow Drenin managed to make himself stand out. And it could have been the fact that he blew up a couple of labs, but things happen. It could have been because he created something that had more legs and tails than it had at the beginning of the experiment. But he had a bold vision and a lot of natural talent. And the Academy felt that they could probably maybe constrain him a little and turn him into a useful mage for the kingdom. And they were partially successful. He did graduate at the top of his class, or at least the top 3. And he went on to decide to go into research. The kingdom had a research department, and he was brought on. And he showed a lot of success. Within the first 12 years of his graduation, he was able to develop 3 different plants and 2 different animals that were considered to be of great benefit to the underground kingdom of Mariga. This brought his attention to the High Council, who put him into the Special Projects division of the research, where he proved himself to be just as adept and just as dangerous as he was when he was in the academy. Another 20 years passed, and he'd made a major name for himself by this point. And his colleagues and the students that got to work with them had begun to call him the Mad Mage, because he had a certain glint in his eye, and he was willing to try things that most other mages wouldn't. There didn't seem to be anything that he really wouldn't try his hand at if he thought it would succeed. Shortly after that, the Queen herself called him to court and asked him to be joined the advisory council of the fellow spellcasters, which was quite prestigious. It wasn't the High Council, mind you, but it was just below that. And he was rather young. For some 44 years, he served on that council until eventually he was the head of it. And when he finally made a major breakthrough that not only improved some of the smelting processes that the kingdom was using, but turned out a better product, saving the kingdom both money, time, and making them more cash, the queen decided that even though he was considered young for a dwarf, that he would become the official court mage. This gave the Mad Mage a lot of prestige and a lot of leeway. It also meant that there was no one supervising him anymore. So he went on his merry way and started doing his merry things, turning out disasters here and there, occasionally worse than others. He did create the hook horror, which got out and then began to proliferate in the caves beneath the kingdom itself. But what's one more monster in the pantheon of monsters that dwarves deal with on a regular basis? He kept his head down for a while after that one and just kept plugging along. And he did this for a full 100 years. A little more than 100 years, before he decided to turn his attentions to defensive measures. See, a friend of his had been wounded in a goblin raid. Now, goblin raids and cobalt raids were fairly common, and they were fairly low-level things. But his friend had been doing some research, got caught out with a patrol, and got injured. And that really set the Mad Mage off. Not in anger, but in earnest dedication. He would find a way to make sure that the kingdom was safe from these attacks. Occasionally, there would be incursions that were more serious than goblins and kobolds. The most serious of all were the drow and their janissaries, their slave warriors. They could be very dangerous. They would often make raids to kidnap dwarven miners and smiths to put into their slave-based economy to help benefit their culture. and nothing rankled more to a dwarf than the idea that one of their brethren and sistren was slaving away for a drow. So when people learned from the grapevine that the Mad Mage was working on defensive measures, people gave him support. And he worked at it for decade after decade. When he turned 350, he went to the Queen and said, I think I've got it. I think I figured out what I can do. But it's going to take me time and effort, and I'm going to have to dedicate it to myself to it in a way that I can't be your court mage. So you're going to have to find a new one, and you're going to have to cut me a lot of slack, because I think I can do it. By this point, the Queen fully endorsed Drenin's efforts. And even though she herself was nearing the end of her tenure, her daughter was also fully supportive of Drenin's efforts. So the Queen and the Princess gave him access to the treasury, place to work, and all the assistance he could get. He went to work. He worked for 102 years, often working around the clock until he just passed out in his lab, his assistants having to drag him to a bed and making sure he ate and drank. Rumors were that he didn't even drink alcohol because he was afraid that it might lessen his ability to think, something which was more than just a little bit aberrant in the dwarven community. But after 102 years, he told the Queen, I've done it. I found the thing that will keep us safe. And I can't tell you what it is. But it's ready. Anytime you want to, you give the word. And the kingdom of Merida will be safe. By this point, he was old. And he knew he was near the end. His assistant had been fully trained, and as had her assistant. So there were people ready to take over after he was gone. And finally, the Mad Mage passed on. A statue was put up to him, made from the finest dwarven bronze. And people remembered all the great things he did and downplayed some of the worst ones he did. Nostalgia has a way of doing that. The mages, of course, would laugh about his failures, because they tended to have a dark sense of humor. And his assistant prepared for the worst. But she never had to do it. She retired, passing the burden on to her assistant. And she prepared for the worst. Her name was Astrolata. And Astrolata knew that things could get bad because the attacks had becoming more frequent in the last few years. No one knew why, but everyone was on edge. Then one day something happened that no one had ever encountered before in all the kingdom's history. Terrorist attacks. The kingdom had been infiltrated by doppelgangers disguised as dwarves. And they set off explosions and spells and poisonous events and disease. And it sent the people into a panic. And in that moment, the drow and their janissary attacked. In the largest fight, the largest battle that anyone had ever seen. They poured into the deep tunnels that the dwarves had dug for their mining. Hundreds and hundreds of slave warriors rushing to their death, willing to die in the name of their drow masters. Between the chaos going on in the kingdom itself, amongst the halls of the dwarves, and the tunnels below, Astrolata rushed to the Queen's side and said, Your Majesty, it's time. The Queen was in a panic. There wasn't anything she could think to do. Her forces were stretched thin. Chaos reigned. She said, "Do it." And Astrolata rushed to the machine, which is what it was known as, simply the machine. And she laid her hand upon the soul stone, with one witness, her assistant, to see what was about to happen. For the mage knew what would occur when she said the final incantation, that the only way to fuel the machine was with her life force. But it was for her kingdom, and that seemed a small price to pay. So she said the incantation, and there was a blinding flash of light. It infused the entire kingdom, all its halls, all its peaks, all its rooms, its tunnels, its mines, everything was blinding white for one heartbeat. And as the dwarves began to blink their eyes, they knew something had happened. The first result was that the lowest tunnels began to flood with seawater, which would have been more shocking than anything that people had prepared for, because the kingdom of Marja was nowhere near the ocean. But the enemies had it worse than the dwarves did, because the dwarves, while blinking and fleeing from the water, for the most part, all survived. Very few dwarves drowned. But the drow and their janissaries, they were truly blinded by that flash. They could see nothing. At least, not until they drowned. And they died, sightless, screaming in the tunnels, trapped while seawater covered their heads. No dwarf felt any pity for them. The doppelgangers, those that hadn't been killed, wisely disappeared, hid, and waited, because they also knew something had happened. The dwarves began to poke around. Thankfully, the seawater stopped when it got to the third lowest of the normal mining sections. So the kingdom was not going to be lost. They began to go outside and look around. And that's when they discovered that the entire mountain that was the kingdom of Merja was now sitting on top of a coral reef, where it had settled quite solidly, quite firmly, fused to the rock below. For their kingdom was now an island in the ocean. It was panic of another kind, but there were no more attacks. And dwarves being practical sorts, they began to look at the situation. They made themselves boats out of stone. They began to putter out in the oceans to figure out where they were. Some 50 miles away, they found some Polynesian-type cultures of humans. They also found merfolk and sea elves living in their vicinity. Though those folks were not too happy with the fact that there was now a mountain sitting on top of one of their coral reefs, but there wasn't a lot they could do about it. Very few people had been harmed by this process. Some animals, of course, the plants, and the reef itself was going to have to recover, but it was done, and now they had to deal with the dwarves. In short order, there was a dwarven navy. Trading began with the merfolk and the sea elves and the Polynesians. The dwarves requested that some of the Polynesians would move onto their mountain, which was now this island, to take care of the surface, to cultivate it, to grow the plants and the animals that would work well here, now, because this is where the dwarves were going to stay. Some of the dwarves decided they were going to commit themselves to this and used minor magical alterations to their bodies that cost them a little bit of their life force. And it allowed them to hold their breath for a much longer time, in some cases hours long, like the great sea mammals out in the oceans. But a handful decided to commit themselves even further and gave up a sizable portion of their life force to become fully aquatic, able to breathe both air and water. And this trait would be passed on to their children. The dwarven druids learned how to heal the reef, encourage it to grow, to become the shapes and things that the dwarves needed or wanted. They developed the best bronze in all the world, able to resist all of the ocean's dangers and almost as hard as steel. It became one of the most popular sources of weapons for all the ocean-going races and the Polynesian allies that were both on their mountain and the other islands. They were able to mine once more below, once they figured out where the solid rock was. It wouldn't flood with seawater. So they went back to their business and kept mining along. And the kingdom prospered. And statues were built to Astrolata. And she became a patron saint of this new land. And the kingdom flourished. And the machine of the Mad Mage still sits there, waiting for the next assistant that has to activate it, who's just as dedicated and just as willing to make that sacrifice. No one really thinks it's ever going to happen. They're in a much safer location than they were before. But it's always a bit of speculation. Just where would it take them next?